Now, for thousands of years, the tallest man-made structure on Earth was the Great Pyramid at Giza. For a few centuries, it was England's Lincoln Cathedral, which was the world's loftiest building, until its spire collapsed. But they were all tiny compared with the skyscrapers which sprang up in places like New York and Chicago in the 20th century. And since then, the watchword seems to have been "Build 'em high." Here's some Pathé News footage from 1963.
New York's skyline is undergoing change. New buildings rising on the tight island to the tune of something like $2.5 billion for construction costs alone since World War II. Manhattan's emergence as the front office of the nation brings new working space for 575,000 office workers. A white-collar city rising to replace outmoded structures. An expert calls it the most prolonged and voluminous outpouring of new commercial structures in all history.
Great way of putting it. Well, even some of those American giants of the last century have been completely eclipsed now by buildings in Asia and the Middle East, which are more than 400, 500, even 600 metres high. But the new World Trade Center in New York has just officially been named as the tallest building in the US. Its elevation to America's #1 means it edges the Willis Tower, formerly the Sears Tower in Chicago, into the #2 spot. Here's what some New Yorkers make of it.
It doesn't matter to me that this isn't the world's tallest building. It's just semantics. It's just an important piece of our country, and that's what's important, I think.
I think it's really awesome because it's so high. I've never been in this world, so I've never been in a high building before.
I think it's very good that it's reached the tallest building again because it shows that we came back.
I think that's great. I think it's a great symbol of, our country sort of rebuilding itself after what happened. And so I think that's a great symbolic thing for the States.
Well, the building is still under construction and is due to open next year, but its official recognition as the new #1 in the height stakes comes from a top-level organisation called the Height Committee of the Council on Tall Building and Urban Habitat. Now, I thought deciding which was the tallest building would be pretty obvious. You just measure it. But luckily, Antony Wood, the Executive Director of the Height Committee of the Council on Tall Building and Urban Habitat, was able to put me right on that one.
Not so obvious, Mark, and pretty contentious. I mean, the main issue is what counts at the top of the building. So in our criteria, spires count and antennae don't. And the problem is, I guess, many buildings now have antennae-like spires. So the spirit of this decision between spires and antennae was very much one, if you think about the Chrysler building, where a spire is an extension of the skin, form, mass, and aesthetic expression of the building. It's a morphing of that building into a finial in the sky. And whereas an antennae is a piece of technical equipment, which, to be quite honest, is not a part of the architecture.
All right, so centuries ago, when the tallest buildings in the world were traditionally churches, would the spire count and would the weather vane on the top count?
Well, there you go. The spire would count as an integral part of the architectural vision, and the weather vane would not. It's a piece of functional technical equipment placed on top. But the issue between New York and Chicago is that both buildings have a similar-looking structure on top, and in the case of One World Trade Center, it was designed as a spire, and we have ratified it as a spire, and in the case of the Sears or Willis building, as it's known here in Chicago, that is antennae.
And, of course, there is a traditional rivalry, isn't there, between Chicago and New York as to who's got the biggest. Why is it so important? Why is there this fixation that people have about having the tallest building in the world or the tallest building in their country?
I think the reasons for that has changed. I think throughout history, the world's tallest building has usually been driven by a corporation, and you could see that in the title list. They used to be called things like Sears, Chrysler, Chicago Tribune, Petronas, and actually the agenda's changed. They're now more likely to be called Russia Tower, Chicago Spire, Shanghai Tower, London Bridge Tower. The agenda has changed. Tall buildings are being used to brand cities in the same way that they were used by corporations to brand car companies and things like that. A city almost has to have a modern skyline to kind of be taken seriously in a very competitive world market for economics and commerce and attention. So that is certainly what's been driving a lot of the world's tallest buildings in the last 3 cities that have seen them. You know, Dubai currently, and before that Taipei, and then before that Kuala Lumpur. However, I think the agenda is slightly different here in the US. I think we're looking at a more mature economic environment, which means these buildings have got to stack up first and foremost financially. No one's going to pay for the public prestige or the cultural prestige. They've got to stack up financially. And also, to be fair to the One World Trade Center, there is clearly a symbolism and an importance due to what happened on that site, which I believe, and many on the committee believe, transcends pure height. And this has been very much broadcast as New York, One World Trade Center wins title. But actually, I don't think that building was really going for that title. I think it's the first time in history that we've seen a set height, not tallest, but 1776 to commemorate the Year of Independence. But when it was first announced and started to be developed, there were several other towers in the U.S. which were actually going to be taller than One World Trade Center. Now, the economic recession put paid to all those buildings. And so in the end, One World Trade Center ends up being the tallest. But during that time where we had the Chicago Spire and others that were going to be even taller, there was never any talk from the New York team saying, well, you know, we'll add another 400 feet to our building so we're the tallest, like you see in the Middle East, like you see in Asia. There was never any talk of that because this was always about achieving a symbolic height on a very important site, which had obviously witnessed.
That's Antony Wood, the Executive Director of the Height Committee of the Council on Tall Building and Urban Habitat. Thanks to both my guests, Jyoti Malhotra and Rajesh Ramanand. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.